Hello, and welcome to uPhilosopher. Today, we have a special guest. This is Tyre Gilbert. He is a brilliant fellow who is, in fact, doing his own YouTube show in order to compete with mine. I'm pretty sure that it will very quickly surpass me in views, likes, and comments. So, I'm very excited to have him on because his work has always been brilliant, and conversations with Tyre have spanned many areas of philosophy and social justice, and I've always been amazed with the things that he has to say. His show, well, why don't you tell us a little bit? Give us the title of the show, how we can find it. If do you have Twitter going on for it? All of that.
Right. So the show, you can find it on Twitter, YouTube. There's also an Instagram account as well, and it's you can find it under the name Blacknificent on YouTube or Twitter, either one of those. And the shows generally span about 5 minutes, and we spend a great deal of time just talking about different topics relative to racial equality in each episode.
Okay, what would you go ahead and spell that out for us? Blacknificent.
Oh, yes. Blacknefencence.
Okay,
I think I got that
fantastic. So now the show's not out yet,
Not yet,
but
no.
your Twitter is,
Mhm.
right? Okay, so let's get that out as soon as we can because I think people are really going to love to see it. So today I just wanted to take the opportunity to talk with you first about your goal with the show, and then kind of see where we go from there in terms of the issues of social justice,
Mhm.
right, and racism. Particularly, your show is going to be about.
Sort of in the beginning, just opening up a dialect about the problems relative to racism, and it's just creating a space where people can talk about the issue.
Very cool. So, are you suggesting that we don't have spaces to talk about the issue? And can you clarify what issue it is that we'll be talking about?
Well, in terms of having a space to talk about it, it seems like there's sort of just two sides to the argument, and they're sort of facing in the complete opposite direction. You see, some people would have you believe, just generally cutting it down, there's people who don't believe in racism at all, and people who do, and they can't seem to open up a dialect with one another and see each other's side of the coin. And I sort of want to approach the situation in a level-headed manner and sort of create a space where people can come together and talk about both sides of the argument.
Very cool. So, the argument then being, does racism exist or not? Right? And then, so some people are saying it does, some people are saying not at all. So, do you think? All right. So here's one kind of fairly obvious question, right? Do you think that this issue of race relations, and are we presumably talking about in terms of your own show? Are we presumably talking about the black community and the white community and their interactions?
Right. I didn't want to limit it to that. I would spend a great deal of time talking about that because I have insight into that. That's what I would know the most about. I've done research on that specifically, but I did want to cover racism eventually as a whole, just regardless of what race it is, just racism in America everywhere, how we deal with it, how it affects everyone in their lives, just regardless of what race they are.
So, well, first of all, I have to say, I'm so very excited about this idea. When you told me about it, just first of all, the idea of you having your own show is fantastic. I know that people are going to love it. But secondly, the idea of there being a space where we're not just presenting one side. That just happens to be something that I personally really agree with, that we need a full dialogue. And it's really nice that it'll be specific to a particular concern and that we can really dig into that you can really dig into that. And so I look really forward to seeing it. So my question then is, so in the issue of race relations, do you think that we are getting better or worse? In other words, are race relations improving or not?
Well, my concern, one of the things I did a lot of research in when it comes to racism is subconscious racism. And one of the most interesting things that I found is that people think this idea of subconscious racism has gotten a lot worse with the dawn of we've had more movies and TV shows that have these same sort of character types reflected in them. So you'll see like they say comments like in certain movies, oh, there goes the token black guy, or
Right, right.
something like that. He's the character for comedic relief,
Right.
just a side character.
But
It's
it
the
reminds me of South
African-American.
Park. They literally named the black character Token.
Oh, yeah, of course, fittingly so. Yeah.
Yeah, but perhaps problematically. But that still hasn't answered my question. Are we getting better or are we getting worse? Or is that am I being too simplistic?
Well, it's a hard question to answer. I would say, all in all, we're getting worse in the sense that,
Goodness.
yeah, in the sense that it's something that's becoming just ingrained into our culture.
Right. Well, it's interesting because what I hear and what you're saying is reverberates with a philosophy teacher I had who did work on sexism. And the work was really quite brilliant. Her major concern in teaching undergraduate classes was that people would think that sexism was done, that it wasn't really a problem anymore, and as a result, it was getting worse. It was like instantiating itself more deeply into our culture. So it's kind of like I was just talking with some colleagues about this just yesterday. This idea that now that to make an analogy, now that gay marriage is legal, people are like, oh, we no longer need to worry about that. The gay community's fine, right? We don't have to worry about that. And I remember when Barack Obama was elected, and I remember people telling me, well, now racism's not a problem. Right. And I was like, all you have to do, this was at UNF in particular, I was like, all you have to do is go into the bathroom right over there and see Obama is and then N-word, right, scribbled on the bathroom stall to know, like, obviously this isn't the case. So it seems to me, though, really hard to make the argument that it's worse. Because couldn't someone say to you, well, I mean, Tyree, black people can come to the same schools now. They don't have to sit, in the back of the bus, right? We're sharing water fountains. And in fact, someone might even say something like, well, I mean, as a college-age man, there's a chance that you have a better chance of being admitted into a college than a white man with the same GPA, so on and so forth. So how can we honestly say that it's worse given those facts?
Right, like I said, it's a hard question to answer. But that's one of the topics that I want to talk about is like people on one side who say racism is pretty much done with. They bring up points like that. Like they'll say some of the things that you said, or some of the things like slavery's gone away with, or that blacks can go to the same school now, and things like that. That's something that everyone can get behind, I think. Mm-hmm. I think you can look at slavery and say, yeah, that was racist. Of course it was. It was us. Well, most people, that is.
I'm trying to imagine the point in time where people, sorry to interrupt, where people are like, this isn't really racist, right? We're getting good work done. Like, I mean, what would the justification be?
Yeah, I remember Bill O'Reilly saying, oh, yeah, when they built the White House, they had slaves doing it, but they were well housed, they were fed, the government.
So it wasn't really racism.
Right. I think it's getting harder to talk about racism because there's less evidence in some cases, there's less evidence for direct racism. But there's still evidence out there, like police shootings, for instance.
Right.
Now, a lot of people bring up the point that, there's more white people being killed by police than there are black people. But that's true in one sense. If you adjust for population per 1 million, though, you'll see that the numbers don't add up because there's a lot more black people being killed by police for the population than there are white people. I think it's more than twice.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I remember checking a statistic not long ago that was suggesting that if you have a black man and a white man with the same criminal history and they go to trial for the same crime, the black man is far more likely to be convicted and far more. We will get much more stringent sentencing.
Right.
So, okay, well, this does seem to get some traction, right? There's this idea of kind of implicit racism. I wonder if we can also look at it in the following way. I mean, tell me what you think about this, because it seems that there's an argument to be made that racism is getting worse, though I think part of the reason why we can say that is not only do we have to worry about these shootings and so on and so forth, But maybe part of our definition of worse is that people think it's not a problem anymore. So it becomes even more kind of like deeply ingrained. It kind
Right.
of just like becomes more and more okay. And so we start having fewer people fighting for it. I don't know. But leaving that argument aside for a second, I thought that racism was getting better for a while. And then I learned more about institutional racism, right? And some of these ideas that we're touching on here. And I was like, wow, maybe it is getting worse. But at least the overt racism is less of a problem until last November,
Right.
right? and,
Well,
and all of a sudden, I felt like racism, and not just against the black community, suddenly kind of became somehow more okay. So like there's been all this vandalism of say like Jewish cemeteries,
mhm.
right? And people suddenly seem very comfortable going, we no longer have to be PC. This is our First Amendment right to say what we want. So I mean I wonder honestly, Tyree, if we're not seeing a resurgence of just straight up overt old fashioned racism.
I don't know. It seems like it feels like something that just changes along with the times. There's I think there's a lot of sort of a social aspect to it. The more people that get comfortable with something, the more people that come out about how comfortable they truly are with it. And then I think that sort of applies to racism within our country, and how just throughout times it seems like it maybe might have more of a resurgence at certain time periods.
Right.
It could have something to do with that.
So just kind of an ebb
perhaps.
and flow.
Yeah.
I know that there's a theorist, a historian who wrote a text called something along the lines of "Lies Your Teacher Told You." Lowell, I believe, is the last name, and he talks about this nadir period of race relations, right, where we generally think of it as a time in history where, from the Civil War to now, race relations have been improving. But in fact, that there's this period where it got better, right, after the Civil War, and then actually got a lot worse, and then started getting better again after the Civil Rights Movement, right? And so, for instance, like everyone thinks that Jackie Robinson was the first major league black baseball player, but in fact he wasn't. It's just there were major league black baseball players before the nadir period, and then the nadir period around 1890 hits, and race relations go to hell,
Right.
and they kick all the black baseball players out. And so what we mean when we say Jackie Robinson's the first black baseball player is the first
To get recognition.
right to get recognition, but also to fight past segregation as it had been legalized here in the States. So I think you're right. I think that there is definitely an argument for an ebb and flow. I guess one of the questions then becomes, okay, well, let's say we're in a period in which, okay, maybe it's going to get a little bit worse, and hopefully not for long, and hopefully things will get better. What do you suggest in terms of ways that we can do to improve things? Okay, so we're spotting the problem. Is there a way to address it?
I think the best solution to deal with racism, or one of the best at least, that is just education. I think I forget who it was that said it, but I think they associated racism with ignorance. It's just something that you see. Well, I'm more rather direct racism. That is, it's something you see associated with people who just don't have a better understanding of things. And I think the best way to combat racism would just be to educate people, to have them get a better understanding of the world around them and themselves.
Yeah. So are we talking about something that should be happening in public education, or I mean, how do we do that? I mean, because there's a couple of things that come out of this. Like one, I can imagine someone hearing this and responding, "Wait a minute, are you saying that I'm ignorant?" Right?
Right.
And so they might say, I mean, there's plenty of people who might hear something like that and go, "Well, I've been mistreated by the black community." Right? So I've known people who have said things like, "Well, when I went to school, I went to a school that was largely black populated school, and they were very mean to me. Like I
Right.
was the only white kid in class." And so they might say, "Well, no, this isn't ignorance on my part. I just happen to have seen and experienced blood." So first of all, what do we say to that person? And then how do we actually address this educationally? Like, what do we mean when we say to educate differently?
Well, the concern I have with someone who would come to the conclusion of perhaps getting a sort of negative feel for the African American community based on maybe a particular situation they had with a group of black people is, see, I think that could possibly boil down to them not having enough of an understanding of the world as a judge someone or judge a social group that is based on your experiences with one particular subdivision of that social group. That in itself is, I think, without them realizing it, racist. And that's not to insult them, that is, but it is more or less ignorant.
Right.
I think just getting them to realize that would be the key. I don't mean to insult anyone when I say it's sort of ignorance that's causing some of the racism within America, but I mean, I would say that I'm ignorant to some things, and in that aspect, I think that they would be ignorant relative to the subject of racism.
Yeah, I can't help but put it in terms of, so they have studies that show that people who have, well, this is going to sound terrible as I say it, the people who have pets are much more flexible to the idea of like animal rights, and it's because they actually like see their dog or their cat seeming to have feelings and so on and so forth. So I can't help but think maybe part of what you're suggesting, correct me if I'm wrong, is like if you are not around a group of people, if you do not know those people, and if you haven't met more than just this kind of token, right, or select group, then what we mean by ignorance is basically you have a lack of exposure, so you don't really know fully what it's like to engage in this group of people. So maybe you think that they dress like this or speak like this or whatever else for this reason, but because you haven't really known them, you're just kind of taking your best guess. And I guess part of maybe what the response could be is this idea of, I know that many people who, we number one have this idea that, say, Southerners, for instance, being in Florida, this seems especially appropriate, that they themselves are racist, but also they hear that they're ignorant a lot, right? And so, like, when we want to give an example of someone who's ignorant or stupid in TV and media, so on and so forth, we tend to give them a Southern accent, right? If we want to show that someone's racist, we tend to give them a Southern accent. But interestingly enough, New York is like the most segregated school system in the country, right? We would think it would be somewhere like Georgia, but it's not, because we went through so much trouble to desegregate Georgia that the self-segregation in New York is kind of like slid by. So I wonder if there's something to be said for, we could kind of appeal to people like, well, when you see other people act like you aren't smart because you're a blue-collar worker in the South or something along those lines, or because you're a blue-collar worker in middle America, right, that it's the same kind of mistake. Like, they don't know. They think that coal miners are just these ignorant schmucks. But in reality, like, if you meet them and you see the depth of their skill set, right, then you realize, like, how much about them you don't really know, right, and how many assumptions you're making. So here's another question that comes to my mind, right? What about your own personal experience, Tyree?
In terms of
racism,
dealing with
yeah. I mean, what is it like for you? I mean, if that isn't too personal.
Oh no, not at all. I've noticed there's small things. The small things every day that you'll notice, like the thing I notice the most would be going into a corner store or a gas station anywhere, and you'll notice the clerk every now and then. You'll see them glance at you, and you don't think of anything of it at first until you notice it. It's the repetition of it, how often it happens. That seems odd to you.
Wow, that's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So now, how do you know you're not just being paranoid?
Well, okay, a lot of people could draw that conclusion, right? Yeah. I would say it's the frequency in which it happens. And now, some people could just say that, well, because you're black, you're just drawing that assumption.
Right.
But I've heard people talk about it. It's not just me. I've heard it online. I've heard it from people publicly speaking about it. It's something that people in our community deal with, and people in other minority communities deal with.
Right.
And that's when you have to realize that there's just too much evidence there. There's a reason that it's happening, and it seems to be relative to racism.
That is interesting. And I feel like there might be an analogy, and this is not a particularly good analogy because your experience is likely a good deal worse. But there is this thing where you realize, like as a man, there's this kind of constant suspicion that you are in fact somehow aggressive, particularly towards women. You know, that women, because I mean, there's so much sexism here in the States and aggression against women that women are really sensitive to it. So like, if you're like a man walking behind a woman, like often they will become increasingly like I've kind of come to realize like it's really important that I make myself seem as innocuous as well, you know, because I'm already a kind of like small villainous looking fellow, you know, and so I kind of go out of my way because I'll see you know if I'm anywhere near a woman, it's just kind of like is he looking at me for because what I did not know is how often women actually deal with people coming up to them or accosting them or touching them or actually doing things. So they have this concern.
Right.
So then final question. Do you think then that someone could reply to you, well, maybe similarly, I have this concern with you coming into the store. I'm giving you these sideline glances because that's what my experiences have led me to. Right. In other words, when someone's more likely to steal from my store every time, right? I'm at a convenience store. Every time someone shoplifts so far, it's been a black man.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we say to this?
Well, I think what's problematic there. So I've done a lot of research into some of the claims that most of the crime that happens in America is proportionately done by African American males, and I think the problem there lies in the fact that most of these African American males are forced into ghettoized zones or zones where there's just worse education, and that's what leads to that rise in crime for that social group. I think the best way to deal with something like that would be to just maybe try and, I guess, public education would be the best solution for that point there. And I understand where that person could be coming from, where they say like, well, I have noticed that there are more African American males stealing from my stores, so I do keep an eye on them more often. But I think they have to realize that that mindset there could only add to the problematic nature of racism.
Yeah. That seems to me, Terry, such a beautiful way to say it and to kind of point it out, which is the realization that racism, even if you have some sort of personal experience, and I think this is what a lot of people's response is going to be like, well, I've had this personal experience with a black person, so on and so forth. I feel justified somehow, or I applied to a college and I didn't get in, but I know that this other black person who didn't have my GPA did, so on and so forth. The realization that in combating racism, which isn't something that happens on its own, right? Is that in combating racism, what we really want to ask is what kind of people we want to be. Do we want to be inclusive or exclusive? Do we want to be the kind of people who help add to the problem, right? As you pointed out, like through my suspicions and so on. Do I want to add to it? Do I want to help make it worse? Or do I want to find a way to help make it better and be more inclusive? So this has been absolutely fantastic, Tyree. You're just amazing to have on the show. I cannot wait to watch your first episode, and I will be clicking like with fervor. So, Tyre Gilbert, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody else, Tyre, your show is called Blacknificent, and look for it in the very near future. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.